So it's great to have all three speakers with us up here again to wrap it up this afternoon. I have just a couple questions for them, and then if you have questions, and we know many of you do, Joe Rutten is going to be manning the microphone out in the crowd, so just catch his attention and he will make his way over to you and help me run it after that. So speakers, I know we have a number of folks this afternoon with us who are from nonprofits, and I think you have given a lot of helpful information for them to take away. But could we maybe talk a little bit, from the perspective of the one doing the ask? What should the teams at the nonprofits be keeping in mind as they run their organizations and as they try to make that case for financial assistance? And I'm going to have each one of you tackle it. So whoever would like to go first is fine with me. Start at the end with Amy, maybe?
Okay.
Why not?
So I ask for money all the time. It's part of what private college presidents do.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think the success of that ask is often linked with the vision and how well you've listened to that donor. So you sometimes have to understand where their heart is. Frank made reference to them wanting to make an investment. They do. They want to understand it as an investment. They want to see that their dollars can be a tipping point in creating something that adds even more instrumental value to that organization or to that purpose. So I think my experience in soliciting large, major gifts, I guess, would be that it takes time to cultivate relationships and to really be attentive and listen. Sometimes I think our role is as much pastoral as it is anything else. And so how are we listening? How are we then understanding what their passions and how does that align with our organization and our organization's aspiration? And then fundamentally, how does that investment pay dividends that propels the organization from where it is at present to something greater? And that greater impact piece is something I always am compelled to share with our prospective donors.
I have a fair number of people who approach me about giving money. And I actually view that as a blessing. And if they all came with the approach that Amy just spoke about, it would be even more of a blessing. So here's a suggestion I would make. So I have a variety of people come ask for money, but particularly Catholic folk, good Catholic people with good apostolic work that they're doing. Because if they're not good, if they're for something I don't believe in, I don't even meet with them, right? So they're good folks. And many times they will say to me, oh, I feel so bad asking you for money. I bet you get approached all the time. And I say, let's have a deal. The deal is you never feel bad about asking me for money. Because that's part of what you do, and I'm part of the process I'm supposed to be. You never feel bad about that, but I never have to feel bad if I don't feel called to it and I say no. And they say, oh, absolutely. And then half of them keep the deal. And I don't care whether sweet, pious nuns, priests, bishops, whomever, because they really need the money. And I get it. Because I've been I'm involved with causes, in schools and things like that. So I've asked people for money, and you really need it to help the apostolate, to help the mission. You really need it, and they've got it, and boy, can't they just see it. But it's funny how sometimes when I say no, I can tell, wow, something just changed. And then I realize they're not being evil, but I realize I'm an instrument for them. I'm something that helps them get their and that's okay. But I feel like an instrument, as opposed to it gets to what Michael talked about with when you're looking at people you give charity to, are they the object or the subject? And if someone approaches me, as Amy was just describing, as if I'm the subject, and they're really trying to see if there's a sync between their vocation and the cause they're working with and my vocation, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. But if I'm kind of the object that helps them get their thing done, it can kind of show through. And like I said, it's a blessing to be asked for money, because they don't ask unless you have some. But I would caution about that, because it's very easy to ask, and I've done the same thing, asking people for money, to view them as the instrument toward your achieving what you need to get achieved, as opposed to viewing them as a human being with a vocation, and they should only really give if it fits into their vocation.
Michael?
Well, I think they've both, Amy and Frank, have summarized it. I will tell you, it's true. I said to our executive director, Frank's been on our board for years. I said to executive director and our new COO, who was actually on our board and then foolishly decided to work for us after he retired, I said, I'm seeing Frank tomorrow. Is there anything you want me to say? And they both said, tell him to send money. So there you have it. And we all just started laughing anyway. But send money, Frank. So I'm going to show him a picture of my children. Send money, Frank. Okay. No, so I work for a nonprofit. Luckily, I don't have to do that much fundraising, which is a blessing for me. But I just get to spend the money. But I think it goes to the point that both of them made. I think two things to reiterate. One is, Frank mentioned the overused term synergy, which comes from also, St. Paul uses the term synergy, right? Meaning a co-workers, like where we're working together with God. And he says we are co-laborers with God. And if you go back to Genesis, we are called by God to participate and to complete his creation, as the Catechism tells us. And I think one thing is to make, in a sense, this case that has two elements to it. And one is that in requesting to partner with somebody, it is really a partnership. Because if we think about, again, what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is someone who comes up with a solution to solve a problem. Now, most of these solutions can be done through people getting together to form a company. But sometimes a company is not the right vehicle to solve the problem that's needed. And in that case, it's nonprofit, then you need people who have profit and who want to do other things to partner with you. Now, Frank is maybe a little bit unique as kind of an intellectual entrepreneur, but there are many entrepreneurs who say believe in the work that we do. They can't do the work we do, right? And I can't do the work that they do. And so what happens is you have two groups of people, or two people who believe in the same thing, who want the same thing with different skills. But instead of it being a company where you work together, there's a nonprofit and a donor. And I think looking for this way of, we're now going to work together with people's insight, and like when you have board members, you want the board members to not just give you a check. That's instrumentalizing the board member. You want the board member to have something to say, and it's this intersubjective dialogue. So I think one is that synergy, and I think the second goes to Frank's point, which is no one wants to be instrumentalized. And you hit it like, hey, you're my buddy, will you give me money? No. Instead of, okay, we're still buddies. Right? That we're still in this relationship because I'm not simply using you for something. And that's why I gave the example of Adam and Eve. Because it's the underlying problem, one of the underlying problems that comes from the fall. We objectify one another. So I think what applies to in every aspect of life applies in relationship to donors, who are not some unique category of human being, but are human beings like us who want to be treated like subjects and who want to be part of something they believe in.
Great thoughts, thank you. We heard from a number of you in the breaks who were really impressed by the global themes that came up this afternoon, but you talked about trying to make it a bit more local, particularly when we talk about poverty. And speakers, we have, unfortunately, an increasing amount of poverty in this community. We have extreme poverty on our Native American reservations in South Dakota. So can you maybe give us some thoughts, and we can start with Michael this time and work this way, on how we might address that more locally?
Well, when I talk about poverty, which I do quite often after doing the film, and I get the question often, like, okay, what should we do? And so my answer is always the same: I don't know. I don't know what to do. And the reason I don't know what to do is I don't know the situation you're in. I don't know the people with whom you're working. I don't know all of the things that are going on. So part of it, and this is so unsatisfactory because we always want a call to action, but the first call to action, I think, is the call to think differently about the problem, and then to engage with the people that you're trying to help. And so I mean, I think if you look at, say, Native Americans, I mean, part of their problem is, in fact, related to the problems I mix. So like Hernando de Soto makes this point, there's a difference between having sovereignty with no private property and private property, right? But anyway, so these are, but my first thing is to say that, the answer is, I don't know, because it takes intersubjective relationships to engage with people that you're trying to help, to see what their needs are, and then what gifts we have to be able to help. I sometimes say this to college students, and college students are fun because they'll respond, as you know. Like I say, now let me ask you a question. I'm like, you want to go to Africa? Like, yeah. I'm like, you know anything about chicken farming? You know anything about, I want to do microfinance. You ever done any banking? Can you balance your checkbook? Like, no. So you are a upper middle class white person from a wealthy nation, and you're going to go help somebody run their chicken farm, right? And so, but part of it is, and they usually kind of laugh and like, oh yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about it. And I said, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get the skills to do those things if that's what you want to do. But they don't sometimes think because we're blessed with money or blessed that we somehow have this like unique wisdom to impart to others. I mean, it's hard to live on $2 a day. And if somebody can live on $2 a day, they're pretty creative and pretty thoughtful. And so if you're going to deal with poor people, engage them as persons. And I think the second point I would make, and not to go too long, is that especially in the domestic question, poverty is not so much a problem of exclusions from institutions of justice. I didn't say it's not, I said it's not so much a problem. The fundamental problem in the United States with poverty is the question of family. And so the statistics, I'm slightly off, but generally that if you come from an intact family, of biological parents and children, and of course tragedy happens, but you know what I'm talking about. If you come from an intact family, and if you're Caucasian, the chance for you being in poverty is about 8%. If you're from a broken white family, your chance of being in poverty is in the 30s. If you're from a non-intact, broken African American family, your chance of being in poverty is like 48, 49%. It's the highest. And if you're from an intact African American family, your chance of being in poverty is 8%. Just like the Caucasian family. So family is an incredibly important relationship for not just for human flourishing, but for economic success and poverty, as is all the questions of civil society and the connections that go around it. So I think building what Bert calls little platoons and getting people in civil society is one, and thinking about family and civil society is one of the important things that we need in this country, I would think.
The last part of what Michael said, I'll just do a brief echo on it. I think every time we go try to help the poor, we should ask ourselves, does what we're doing strengthen their family? And does what we're doing strengthen their faith? I think you can do every other social program in the universe, and if the family is weak within any society, the society is going to be weak. And our theology teaches us the family is the domestic church. So listen, again, I think the phrase dysfunctional family is a redundancy. I've never met the family that was completely, functional. Okay, everybody comes from a dysfunctional family. It's hard stuff. It's hard to live with one another and love one another and sacrifice for one another. Having said that, there's dysfunction, then there's dysfunction. And so I just think in everything we do, so many of our poverty programs have not supported the family or have even fractured the family because you give kind of perverse incentives for things. So I don't know, like with regard to the Indian reservation, as Michael said, a lot of it is what's happening local. But I think the two of the principles we need to keep in mind is, does it strengthen the family? Does it strengthen the faith? Mother Teresa said she saw more poverty in the U.S. than she'd seen in India because it was spiritual poverty. So I think there's a spiritual poverty that we also don't want to neglect.
I was just going to say I had a real privilege of actually spent about 8 months over in India and working with women in microfinance. As a college student, but I did have business background. One of the key lessons that I think we've learned in our lives and in working with college students, and we do take and collaborate in partnerships with a variety of people on our American Indian reservations. And our collaborations are around suicide prevention and work with young people on the American Indian reservations, is that they're partners in the process. They're co-creating the kinds of initiatives that we're embarking on. I'm reticent to just throw my hands up. So I'm really inspired by the young people that work and I'm surrounded with every day. I'm reticent to say the only way to solve this is X, Y, or Z, because I think, and Pope Benedict does a nice job of talking about this, but he said gradualism can be possible. So in other words, we can start to take incremental steps, even if we aren't getting to the best program. Some program is better than no program, right? As long as it's guided thoughtfully. Okay.
Yeah.
So by that I'm saying when we've invited, in the American Indian community, it takes a long time to earn their trust. There's a lot of history behind that. When we've invited them to be partners in addressing a particular social issue that's really rampant on the reservation, whether that's suicide, whether that's poverty, whether that's teen mothers, we need to consider them as partners in that process. And I don't think we should give up hope on them. We just have to help see that our time frame and how we envision seeing solutions evolve often isn't quite God's time frame. And this work is difficult and it takes a long time and there's ups and downs and we don't always see a linear path of progress, but that shouldn't mean that we give up hope on committing to an ethos of partnership that's grounded in a spirit of charity and mercy and justice. So, yeah.
Can I add really quickly, just to follow, because you said something that I think is really important, and that maybe the third point, which follows on Amy's point, is that there's a difference between gradualism and charity and mercy and justice and social engineering. And the social engineering is the kind that wants this immediate response. And it's like, we're not supposed to social engineer poor people. Okay, that is a bad way of thinking. And I think there's a difference between faith, family, and this kind of gradual, we are called to do something, but in partnership and not in manipulation.
Okay, Joe is waving the microphone at me, so let's...
We were very intentional about the conference this year, and we didn't just want to bring in the business community, but we wanted the nonprofit community as well. So amongst us are people like Feeding South Dakota and Matt Gasson, who does large-scale distribution for poverty relief, and Madeline Shields with the banquet, Chad Campbell with the Bishop Dudley House, and I'm probably forgetting others. So we have the nonprofits here with us. And so I'd just like to have Matt first as a question maybe that he'll ask from that perspective.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, panelists, for taking the time to be with us today. To kind of piggyback off of Jody's initial question, as a nonprofit director and thinking more domestically rather than internationally, as we look at poverty, we know that poverty has many, many symptoms. And we as in the nonprofit world are probably really kind of siloed and designed to try to address individual issues. Ours might happen to be hunger, Chad's might be homelessness, and the like. My question is about where do you see the need for the collaboration of the nonprofits to come together and how that plays into back to that piece about asking or seeking donations from the entrepreneurs and the philanthropists in our communities.
Can I take that, Matt? Just
please, Amy.
Okay.
You've probably heard it before.
So I think there's a lot of investors and foundations in particular who, at least in our region, are beginning to see the power of collaboration. And so oftentimes those grant opportunities, if they're linked with others, have a collective impact that can be even greater. We're doing some interesting work in rural healthcare, for example, and so we're partnering with a major foundation, several hospital systems, mental health facilities, and the university to collectively look at isolation and depression among rural seniors. And it was viewed favorably by this major foundation when we began to think about how to address some of these issues collectively. And we pulled together the resources of a variety of institutions to begin to think about that. And it involved constituents. So what is it about the person who's maybe isolated on a rural farm in Tripp, South Dakota, that we need to understand before we craft solutions, policies, efforts garnered at supporting them in their areas? And we've certainly seen much more success in securing funds from foundations when we've been able to align our efforts around the best thinking of a collaboration of people, because like you said, we know hunger has many roots. Poverty has many roots. I mean, the argument. So I think that when we can get more people around the table as nonprofits, we begin to be able to have a stronger impact. That's just our experience.
I don't really think I agree with the premise of your question or what Amy just said at all. But I might be wrong. It's quite possible I'm wrong on it.
You might not be.
But I might not be, or I wouldn't say what I'm about to say. So I've been around politics for a long time. And you always hear people say, oh, boy, we got this guy with this message and this guy with this guy. If these clowns could just all get their act together, don't they realize how successful they would be? It's like, no. What do you want? If you're a Democrat, you want the DNC to run everything, the Democratic National Committee, or the RNC to run it? Seriously? You think they're going to do a better job? No. You want, if you're in politics, you want all these entrepreneurial candidates running their own show, and it's messy and it's chaotic, and they sometimes stumble over one another. But the idea that we're going to kind of do some Soviet planning style, where they all get together around a table and come up with some plan that gets it done, I think it's foolishness. And I see it in the church. You know, if we could just got all the pro-life groups working together, we'd be so much more successful. No. That grandmother who started the particular pro-life thing about partial birth abortion did it because of something that happened in her life. And this person who's convinced that what we really need is a fetal pain act to be passed, that happened because of that. And this entrepreneur who started because they're convinced that another approach to pro-life, you know, we need to focus on mothers and adoption, has a special passion. And there's a little bit of a utopian idea that if we could just get them all together, it would work better, and I don't think it would at all. Now, I want you to be able to rebut. I do think there are certainly times when groups can work together in a joint venture. So I look at the business world. There's plenty of times when we go work competitors or other people, and we do JVs together, and we do that. But the idea that, well, what we should really do is just all merge. Everybody in the industry should just all merge. And we'd somehow do better for society if we just all had one big company and you only bought your groceries from one grocery store wherever you were in the country because they all just merged together. I don't think would further the cause the best. So anyway, that's an opinion which might be completely wrong-headed.
You are right. You too are right.
Well, I don't know that we were completely.
No, I don't think we did. But I don't think
we were in disagreement per se. But
I think this is. I was joking about you're both right. In some ways, I agree with both of the things you said because I think it's important. Sometimes you want to, if you have a specialty in one area and somebody has a specialty in another area, work together instead of trying to get specialty where you don't have it. Right, and in that sense, yes. I think it's very valuable to work together and to be thinking. At the same time, avoiding the temptation of what your countryman Nassim Taleb calls Harvard Soviet style, right? Which is this kind of idea that we're going to socially engineer, plan everything. Like, we're going to get together and we're going to create a plan that's going to solve the problem. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, we're dealing with complex systems. Right? And this is kind of a Burkean critique of Enlightenment rationality, is that we're dealing with deep levels of complex systems, with human beings, with layers of things that are going on. And part of the modern mind wants simplicity and order. that's part of the mind especially, but the modern mind even more so, wants simplicity and order. And I think, so there's a tension between, you don't have to develop every competency when there are other people who are doing it. So work together, join together in synergy, as we talked about, but avoid this kind of blanket model that we're going to unify everything and that will solve our problems. So I actually do both of you, which is
That's
rare.
a good summary.
Okay.
There's,
Back to Joe.
I'm starting a new gig teaching college here again, so I got to get back in my teacher mode. But what we see here is important. There's two things going on. One, I think everybody in the room would agree that we need a restoration of civil dialogue in our communities again. Amen? And so we have to be able to dialogue about hard issues, difficult situations, and come to different conclusions. And this is something that we talk about, but we don't always understand what's going on here. But it's called the virtue of prudence. And it's prudential judgments. And we can arrive at different conclusions about how to solve issues. And it doesn't have to be a right or wrong necessarily, although there might be a better. So I think this is important that we can model this together, particularly in our political climate, where we can talk about difficult issues, have civil dialogue again, and understand that sometimes prudentially we can arrive at different conclusions. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one person won and one person lost, although it is possible that one could lose, but both could be wrong as well. So with that, we've got Dean Karski. I think somebody's got a question right over here. Wonderful.
Thanks, Joe, and this is a little bit of a change. So Frank, this is directed at you, and I was going to ask this during the social hour, but I think others would be interested in it. Can you tell us more of the story about the gift you gave to the church with the Gospel of John and Luke and the Lord's Prayer? Just kind of what that feeling was like. Was it something that came up immediately? Was it a journey in life? But can you share that with us a little bit?
Yes, and I pause because I want to be respectful of the panel, and I don't want to speak too much about it. But I am happy afterwards to talk, because I will tell you, it's like a rollicking, fabulous tale, and I could go on and on. But in short, it's the oldest copy of the Lord's Prayer and the Gospel of Luke in the world, and the prologue of the Gospel of John. The real importance of it, it's nice to have old things, but there's lots of old things. When I was praying and discerning about this, because I've never really been involved in something like this, I thought, okay, we have one God in the universe, and he came to earth one time. And he gave us one prayer to pray, and this is the oldest copy of it in the world. So you're going to feel like an idiot if you don't, do this. And that may sound like a negative way of thinking, but it's sort of like Ignatian discernment. Does the decision console you? Do you think it's going to lead to consolation or desolation? Mm-hmm. And I thought this sounds like a consolating thing. It ended up being wonderful. This thing was found in the 50s. The oldest New Testament entirety, the oldest full copy of the New Testament that we have in the church is dated about 325 AD. There's one in the British Museum. There's one in the Vatican Museum. These papyrus were found 60 years ago in Egypt, and they predate the oldest Bible we have by like 150, 175 years. Now that's relevant because if some of the claims against Christianity are true, that we were manipulating our Bible for years, and this patriarchal society or these power people were, making Jesus into a hero, but he didn't really do all these stuff, and they were manipulating the Bible. Well, I don't know, maybe that happened. I mean, that's some of the claims, but all of a sudden this thing turns up in the 1950s, and it predates the Bible by 150 years, and guess what? A guy named Cardinal Martini, who was a biblical scholar, did his doctoral thesis, and he lined up the old one and lined up the new one, and it's almost exact, which goes a long way to authenticating our Bible, which is why Pope Benedict was so involved with it. Long story short, it's top 3 blessings of all time for my family to be involved in it. As we presented it to Pope Benedict, he said, "Where are my glasses?" And so he gets out his glasses and he starts reading from the prologue of the Gospel of John in Koine Greek, because he can read Koine Greek, right? And the prologue of the Gospel of John kind of sums up his whole pontificate. It's the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. And it goes on. Now that was relevant. I'm sorry, I'm trying to speak quickly because I don't want to be rude. I'm standing there with my wife and daughter, and so when my little girl was like 7, we would recite the Guardian Angel prayer on the way to school. go back and forth with it. She got a little older and we learned the 23rd Psalm. So I would say, the Lord is my shepherd, and she would say, there's nothing I shall want. We go back and forth. Got a little older, we learned the 27th Psalm, which is a lot longer and a lot harder. She got to 9th grade and I said, let's swap it up. Let's learn the prologue of the Gospel of John. So for 3 years prior to going to see Pope Benedict with this papyrus, for 3 years, every morning, I would say, in the beginning was the Word, and she would say, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we went back and forth. And so there we are, standing with the Vicar of Christ, with the oldest copy in the world, and he's reading from it. And I nudged her, I said, baby, do you know what he's reading right now? She said, yeah, Daddy, I know what he's reading. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, okay, if life ends here, we're good. So anyway, you're kind to ask, and I don't mean to spend so much time on a personal story, but thank you. It's just, it's been a wonderful blessing for my family. And when 60 Minutes went and did the interview there, the librarian said it's the most important thing they have in the library, which is, I don't know if you know, the library is actually the Pope's personal library. It's his personal property. Now, he can't give it to a nephew or something, but I don't know, maybe
anymore.
He could. Yeah, anymore. But anyway, it belongs to the Pope. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
For the record, if you hadn't told the story about your daughter and I would have said you got to tell the story about your daughter, so you can have my time.
Well, no, you're kind, Michael. Thank you.
Joe was in line to ask it too, just so everybody knows, so. Any others?
This is a question for Frank because of the tension of being in business. Every day we have to deal with people who do not share our values, and we have to do business with them. And sometimes in doing business with them, we're encouraging or helping them create wealth to do problematic things. You probably have some examples in your life where you did that. How did you cope with the challenge? And then when did you walk away because you found that one beyond what you could do?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I do think there's it's secondary, right?
Remote.
Yeah, I mean there's evil you do yourself, but then there's a secondary effect. Yeah, and Michael can give you the distinctions better than I can.
This is why I don't make money, because nobody cares. Okay.
So mine's tended to be, I've tended to draw the distinction of, is it my direct activity that's engaging in something that's immoral or evil, or is it my indirect activity? And so, I mean, the fact is, when I pay an employee for their wages, I don't monitor everywhere they spent the money. Maybe the guy went and hired a prostitute. Maybe he hired. There's all kind of bad things you can do, right, with the money, and I don't know that I'm responsible for that. I do think with employees and people you do a lot of business with, it can rub off on you. And so in general, I want to be working with people and doing deals with people who I have moral congruence with. But at the same time, I mean, I'm a sinner. I'm a big sinner. And so everybody I do business with is something of a sinner, maybe a bigger one than me, or maybe a sins less than me. I do think I'm responsible if what I'm doing directly leads to something, and so I try to avoid that.
What do you think, Joe? Anybody else?
Thank you all for coming today. Father Cheney, NDSU Nimitz Center. I just wanted to throw something out there about the connection between property rights and religious liberty, and how we've seen we face a lot of cultural challenges on those fronts in terms of a stalled legislative construct, a fiscal policy that's kind of non-existent, no exit strategy for quantitative easing. So a lot of challenges out there, and but most importantly, religious liberty. You've seen some of the battlefronts with Hobby Lobby, and as of late, Hobby Lobby has been in the news for not good things. So, but on the front of religious liberty, what's our duty, obligation to dig in and to defend those liberties, and where do you see the future?
I'll start.
No, go ahead.
Go.
You're paid to answer questions like that. Sorry, Michael.
It's true.
I know.
She's not going there. She's got to raise money tomorrow. All right. I don't have any friends to lose, so it's all right. Those are all hard questions. Thanks, Father. I mean, I think there is, I'm trying to think how to begin with this because there's so many things. I mean, there is a deep connection between private property and religious liberty that, in fact, I work at a think tank called the Acton Institute. If you like argument and lots of discussion, we have a conference every year. We had 1,000 people from 75 countries, from about 65% Protestant, 60% Protestant, 60% Protestant, 35% Catholic, and then a mix of Eastern Orthodox Jews, and others. It's a place of lots of argument and lots of discussion. And so it's these kind of questions come up. We also did a book called One and Indivisible, which you can get at the Acton Institute, which is a series of talks that were given at a conference. So I did one on private property, but there's Cardinal Sarah did one, and a number of other people as well. So that if you're interested in that topic, we have that book for you to read. So I mean, I think that the problem with property is sometimes what's happening is, and this is such a long question. Sometimes what's happening is that what we're seeing is that there are certain, what you could call like ideological ideas about, say, marriage or whatever it might be, that are being used. There's a threat to religious liberty, and one of the ways they're doing it is by restricting property. But I think it's actually a deeper problem that I'm only going to touch on quickly because it's very complex, and from the wrong for the panel, the time to do this. But what we're actually seeing is a new ontology of the person, and so. We've used the term, Catholics are very familiar and comfortable with the idea of the word dignity. We use the word dignity a lot, and we talk about respecting dignity. What's happening right now, both socially and also in law, you can see it in the Yogyakarta principles of the UN, you can see it in South African law, you see it a bit, and you see some of the origins of it in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, about the idea of mystery and creating your own idea of existence. And you're seeing it kind of where lawyers are actually starting to write philosophical anthropology. That is, lawyers are starting to create philosophy of the person and put it into law. And this is going to become a threat to religious liberty. And so property is one of the ways we're seeing it. But the reason property is important is because it is actually a bulwark against some of it, because it creates space for families to live out their freedom and responsibility, right? That's why. But let me get back to the problem. So what we're seeing here is a redefinition of the person where we're identifying sexual predilection with dignity and ontology, the person. So it's really what you could call a plastic anthropology that's being written into law. And so what happens is the idea of sexual predilection being equated with person and with the dignity of the person is creating a problem in law, and a problem even for Catholics as we think about it, because if your dignity, if your ontology of who you are, right, is defined by your sexual predilection, even if that changes, because it's plastic, remember, it can harden and soften. This creates a problem of how do we address these issues. So the situation, and I'm sorry, it's really complex, and I actually have talks on this, but usually I don't do it at a panel, and I'm trying to go probably too fast, so pardon my the holes in this. But that what's happening is this. There's almost a type of Thomism, but it's a reverse Thomism, where instead of beginning with essence, with the nature of the human person, and then what we begin is with this kind of raw existentialism. And with this raw existentialism, a person can choose his or her sexual predilections, etc. And it's almost solely in the sexual sphere, by the way. And once that's chosen, that plastic, as it were, hardens, and now you have this essential nature of the person. And that's who the person is. Now here's where the problem comes. We would all agree that who you are is much more important than what someone holds. And that no one has the right to treat you badly based on what they hold because of who you are. And so this is why it's morally wrong for, say, a priest to not marry an African American and a Caucasian American, because he's making a judgment based on who he is or who she is, right? The problem is, once we create a new ontology of the person, Where we identify sexual predilection with ontology, and that gets written into law, this becomes a huge problem for religious liberty, because now what you believe is not as important as who somebody is. And even if you look at dignitatis humanae, this idea of dignity, right? We can't use our Catholic principles and our belief and our theology to discriminate against someone because of a certain race or ethnicity, right? Well, once sexual predilection is identified with that, now we're in a problem. So the threats to religious liberty are getting stronger and stronger. Property is, I think, one of the ways you have to stand up against some of these threats. But here's the problem: once this is written into law, now the Catholic priest who says, well, we're Catholics, we don't want to perform a homosexual wedding, now that, based on dignity, that person is discriminating on belief based on identity, right? And that doesn't hold. And so what we see, and this is what happens when you have a totalitarian act of the state. Now, it may surprise you here, but the redefinition of marriage is a totalitarian act of the state. I actually work with a lot of people who are libertarians. And libertarians think it's a libertarian act because you're getting the state out of marriage. But precisely, you are not getting the state out of marriage. The state is redefining a biological and sociological reality. And saying, not only is it redefining it, it's saying, you must obey. Right? And so what we have is this totalitarian move, and so what we're going to deal with in the next, decade or so are going to be these questions of what's dignity, what's conscience, what's religious liberty, and this is going to have impact on property and a host of other things. And so it's a very, very complex situation we're finding ourselves in. And it's difficult to talk about because it's not politically correct, but then again, neither am I. But yeah, it's a lot of problems. So anyway, then there's questions of property and everything else, but that's at least a beginning.
Terrific questions. Thank you very much. Our speakers will be here for the social if you'd like to visit with them further. But for now, let's give them one more round of applause for all of their thoughts today.